3 months before I was supposed to be named VP, my younger brother walked into my father's office carrying my project files, 2.5 years of my work, and presented them as his own. My father leaned back in his chair, proud as I'd ever seen him, and said, "This is the kind of energy this company's been missing." Then, 6 weeks after that, he had the company attorney draw up papers cutting me out of the succession plan entirely. My name's Scott. I'm 36 now, and until about a year and a half ago, I was a senior project manager at Hargrove Construction. My grandfather's company, my father's company, and the place I'd given 9 years of my career, believing it would one day be partly mine. I wasn't delusional about it. I knew how these things worked. You earned your seat, you proved yourself, you brought in the contracts, managed the crews, stayed late when the client called at 9 on a Friday night. I did all of that, and I was fine with it, because I actually believed the version of the story my father had been telling me since I was 25. "Someday, son, this place is yours too." The company wasn't small. Third-generation regional construction out of Central Virginia. Hospitals, school expansions, county government complexes. We had about 180 employees, solid, bonding capacity, and a reputation that took my grandfather 30 years to build, and my father another 20 to hold on to. I wasn't the visionary. I was the guy who kept relationships alive. The one who sat across from clients for months before a project was even on paper. Who knew which county procurement officers wanted a call on their birthday, and which ones you left completely alone until they reached out first. That kind of thing isn't flashy. But it's what keeps a construction company alive between the big contracts. The biggest thing I'd ever worked on. The one I'd been building since before my brother had even enrolled in his MBA program. Was a contract with Methodist Health System. They were expanding a regional hospital, adding 2 wings and a new outpatient center. Total budget close to $38 million. Numbers like that don't come from pitch meetings. You land them by showing up, over and over, until the client trusts you with their real problems, instead of just their official ones. I'd spent 2.5 years doing exactly that. Weekly check-ins. Site visits before there was a site to visit. I knew the facilities directors' kids' names. I knew which subcontractors the systems board had bad history with. I knew what they needed to see in a proposal before they'd feel comfortable signing anything. My brother came home in January of that year. He'd finished an MBA from a school in the Midwest, and the way my parents talked about it, you'd think he'd single-handedly turned around a failing economy. Tanner was always the one they lit up for. That's not me being bitter, it was just true, and I'd made a kind of peace with it over the years. He was charming in a way that I wasn't. Quick with the right words in any room. The kind of person who could walk into a conversation cold and sound like the most informed person there within 10 minutes. That's a genuine skill, but it's not the same skill as sitting through a bad meeting with a nervous client and still leaving with their confidence intact. That took patience. Patience was never really Tanner's thing. At first his questions about the Methodist project seemed fine. He was learning the business. He'd ask what stage we were in, what the client's pressure points were, who the actual decision makers were, versus who just thought they were. I answered everything. I even walked him through my proposal deck once, thinking I was doing him a favor, helping him understand how these long-cycle relationships actually worked. I can trace everything back to that afternoon. That was the last moment. I was genuinely naive about what was happening. In March, my father told me we were doing a joint presentation to the Methodist executive team. He framed it as Tanner shadowing, getting some experience in front of a major client. I brought my materials, I showed up, and what I watched was my brother stand at the head of that conference room, walk through slides I had built, reference conversations I had personally conducted, describe strategies I had developed, and do it like he'd lived through all of it himself. He was smooth. He was compelling. He made 2.5 years of my relationship building sound like a collaboration that had always existed. The client liked him. Of course they did. He was new and polished and made people feel good about writing big checks. We signed the letter of intent 3 weeks later. My father took us both to dinner that night and ordered a bottle of wine I'd never seen him spend money on. He toasted my brother by name. Just Tanner. Not both of us. I told myself it was a one-night thing. A father being proud of his younger kid finally showing up. I let it go. Then came the company-wide meeting in April. My father stood up in front of the whole office and announced that Tanner was being named Vice President of Business Development, effective immediately. He explained that the Methodist contract was proof of Tanner's ability to drive major business at the highest level. People clapped. A few of them glanced at me. I stared at a spot on the back wall and breathed. Afterward, my father called me into his office. He had this look on his face like he was about to share good news. He said my role was critical. That execution was just as important as vision. That he wanted me to work closely with Tanner going forward, in my capacity as senior PM. helping him manage the Methodist project through to completion. What you're describing, I said, is me reporting to my younger brother. He tilted his head. I'm describing a partnership. He's VP, I'm still senior PM, that's not a partnership, that's an org chart. His expression shifted slightly. The patient father look started tightening at the edges. He said Tanner had something the company needed, that fresh energy, that perspective. And that sometimes the best thing you could do for something you loved was step back and let someone else drive for a while. I asked him directly, was I still in line for any ownership stake? Was the succession plan still on the table? He said, let's just see how the next year goes. That was when I understood. There was no next year. Not the kind he'd been describing to me for the past decade. I told him I wasn't going to work under my brother. Not out of ego, but because I'd just watched my brother take the thing I'd spent years building and present it as his own. Watched my father stand in front of 180 people and celebrate it. And I wasn't going to spend another year helping that version of events become the official story of my career. I said if they were moving in a different direction, I wanted to take my minority stake, 11%, set up through my grandfather's succession plan, and figure out my next chapter. My father's face went somewhere I hadn't seen before. Resolved, cold. He said if I couldn't be a team player, maybe the company needed to reassess the ownership structure entirely. I told him to go ahead and have the attorney take a look. 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived. Inside was a buyout offer for my 11%. I read the number twice because I thought I'd misread it. The valuation methodology was one I'd never encountered before, and it priced the company at roughly 40% of what any independent appraiser would have produced. Attached was a non-compete clause covering Virginia, Maryland, and the district for 3 years. My attorney said the buyout was borderline predatory but defensible enough that fighting it would cost me in legal fees, close to what I'd be fighting for. She also said the non-compete had a geographic gap. It covered the Mid-Atlantic, but not the federal contractor markets outside that radius. Not the Carolinas. Not markets I had contacts in but no established business. She told me if I was careful, I could stay in the industry without triggering it. I signed. Not because I agreed with any of it, but because I wasn't going to spend the next 2 years in litigation, fighting for a seat at a table that had already decided I wasn't welcome. The day I cleaned out my desk, my brother was in a client meeting. My mother called that evening to say she hoped I'd find something that made me happy. My father didn't call at all. The next 6 weeks were the hardest part. There's a specific kind of grief that comes from cut out of something you helped build. And it doesn't move like ordinary loss. It comes sideways. You'll be standing in line somewhere and you'll remember some small thing, a problem you solved, a relationship you spent years cultivating, and you'll feel the weight of it now belonging to someone else. I drove a lot that first month. Early mornings, not much traffic, just movement. My friend Pete called every Thursday. We'd worked together at the company for 6 years. Before he left for a competing firm, and he'd watched what happened from a distance. He didn't call to give advice or fix things. He called to check in and actually wait for the answer. Those calls did more for me than he probably knew. Eventually I started moving. The non-compete had its gaps and I was going to use them. I reached out to contacts in markets outside my restriction. I traveled to meetings in the Carolinas. I had conversations with developers in the outer DC market who technically fell outside the geographic clause. I wasn't building a company yet. I was planting seeds while I waited out the clock. 14 months after I left Hargrove, my phone rang on a Tuesday morning. It was the facilities director at Methodist Health, the woman I'd worked alongside for almost 3 years. The one who knew exactly whose work had built that relationship. She asked if I had a few minutes. I said yes. She told me the project had gone sideways. Not from a construction standpoint. The work was getting done, though slower than it should have been. What had gone sideways was more serious. The state attorney general's office had opened an investigation into the procurement process that led to Hargrove being awarded the contract. There were questions about whether a county official involved in approving the contract had received payments in exchange for favorable treatment. She wasn't telling me this as gossip. She was telling me because investigators had already called her. And she expected they'd be calling me. 2 days later, they did. I cooperated fully. I had nothing to hide. I'd built that client relationship, honestly, over 2.5 years. I wasn't involved in any of the contracting mechanics. Once the letter of intent was signed, I hadn't been present for any conversations that had apparently happened after I was pushed out. I told them exactly what I knew, when I knew it, and what I didn't know. It took about 90 minutes. I walked out into the parking lot afterward, and sat in my car for a while. What came out over the following weeks, through my attorney and through the industry, was this. My brother had used a middleman to make payments to a county procurement official who had signing authority over the contract. The investigation pulled financial records and discovered this wasn't the first time. 2 previous public contracts, both before I was in any position of real responsibility, had apparently gone through a similar arrangement. The records my father had been very confident were buried turned out not to be buried quite well enough. And the way it unraveled had a name. Her name was Naomi. She and my brother had started dating a few months after I left the company. From what I eventually pieced together, she worked in the financial crimes division of the state AG's office. She hadn't targeted him deliberately. She wasn't running some long horizon plan. But my brother had the habit of wanting to impress the people he was close to, of explaining his success in ways that were meant to sound shrewd but sounded like something else entirely. When you were someone who spent your professional life building fraud cases, she'd done her job. That's all it was. Naomi left my brother before the first search warrant was executed. I don't know what she was thinking when she did. I don't know if she had complicated feelings about it or none at all. I only know she left, and then everything my brother and my father had built came apart in the slow grinding, public way. That's worse than any single blow. My brother's voicemail came on a Saturday morning. His voice was cracked in a way I didn't recognize. He said he needed to talk to me. I didn't call back. My father showed up at my apartment 3 days later. I opened the door, and he was standing there in a way I'd never seen him. No jacket, shirt untucked, which for him was the equivalent of falling completely apart. He hadn't slept. That was clear. He said he needed help. Attorney fees were significant. The company's bonding capacity had been suspended pending the investigation, which meant they couldn't bid on new work, which meant they were burning through cash with no pipeline behind it. He said some of it could still be managed if people came forward with the right framing, if I would speak to someone on his behalf. I leaned against the doorframe and looked at him for a moment. I already spoke to them, I said. 14 months ago, this company bought me out at a number you know was wrong, put a non-compete on me, and told me I didn't belong there anymore. I cooperated with the investigation because I had nothing to hide. Because I wasn't there when any of this happened. There's nothing I could add now that would help you. And honestly, there's nothing I'd want to add. He started to say something about family, about how this was still something we shared. You told me to let the attorney look at the ownership structure, I said. You told me maybe I didn't belong there. I didn't do this to you. I didn't leak anything. I didn't call the AG's office. I didn't know about any of this. But I also can't show up to save something I spent 9 years building, that you handed to someone else and then lost. That's not how this works. He stood there another moment, jaw tight, looking for something else to say. He didn't find it. He turned and walked back to his car. I watched him go from the doorway, then closed the door and stood in my kitchen. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter, like a chapter that had been left open far too long had finally closed, and the room was lighter for it. The investigation took the better part of a year. My brother eventually pleaded to a reduced charge. A misdemeanor related to improper procurement practices rather than the felony bribery count they'd originally pursued. He was fined heavily, placed on probation, and permanently barred from bidding on government contracts. Hargrove Construction filed for dissolution 8 months after the story went public. A company my grandfather built from nothing. Gone. My father didn't fight it. He retired into something that looked more like disappearing than stepping down. I won't pretend I felt nothing about that. Somewhere underneath everything else, there was still grief for what the company had been before any of this. For the version of it my grandfather had built honestly. What happened wasn't my doing, but it wasn't nothing to lose. I had my own thing to build. The non-compete expired on a Thursday in November. By Monday, my firm had its first official proposal out to a medical office developer in Raleigh I'd been in quiet conversations with for over a year. Pete came on as operations director. I brought in 2 other people I trusted, not because they'd passed some test, but because I'd seen how they behaved when things got hard. That's the only interview that matters. I wasn't starting from zero. All those months of patient quiet work in markets outside my restriction had produced real things. Conversations that became meetings. Meetings that became trust. Trust that was becoming contracts. The first major project we signed was a community health clinic expansion in Chapel Hill. Nothing like $38 million. But it was mine, clean, earned every step of the way. I remember sitting at my desk the night after we got the signed agreement and thinking I hadn't felt that specific kind of satisfaction in years. Maybe ever. I met Molly at an industry conference in the spring. Structural engineer, healthcare construction focus. Professionally we overlapped. And personally, after our third conversation, it was clear there was something more than that. She wasn't performing for anyone. She had no angle. She laughed at my dumb job site humor, in a way that felt honest, rather than polite. And when she asked about my work, it was because she actually wanted to know the answer. I didn't know how much I'd needed that until I had it. A few months in, we were driving back from a site visit, and she asked if I ever missed it. The family company, the history of it, all of that weight. I thought about it for a while, before I answered. I miss what I thought it was, I said. I don't miss what it turned out to be. Those aren't the same thing. She nodded. Because they aren't. I ran into my father once, about 6 months after the company dissolved. We ended up at the same pump island at a gas station, and both realized it at the same moment. He looked older and thinner than I remembered. He said something like, "How are things going?" And said, "Pretty well." And we both understood that was as far as it was going to go. He drove away first. I watched his car pull out onto the road and didn't feel much, which I've come to understand, is its own kind of resolution. My brother and I haven't spoken since that unanswered voicemail. I don't carry rage about it anymore. Rage takes energy I need somewhere else. What I carry instead is a clear memory of exactly what happened and what it cost me. And a willingness to let that live in the past where it belongs, instead of dragging it into every room I walk into now. Pete still checks in every Thursday. It's a standing lunch now instead of a phone call. We added a general contractor from Durham to the rotation. Someone I met through a job in the Carolinas who became a real friend the ordinary way. By showing up and being decent over and over. My crew. Not blood, not obligation, not legacy. People who chose to be there without needing anything from me that I hadn't already earned by being someone worth choosing. My grandfather used to say that in this business, your word is your bond. He meant it the technical way, bonding as insurance, the thing that lets a contractor bid on major work. But he also meant the older version. That who you are in a deal is who you are, period. You can't separate the two. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't know the lesson would end up applying to his own family the way it did. I build things now. Real things, on clean ground. And every time I walk a job site, I don't have anything to prove to anyone who isn't standing right there next to me. That's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything I needed. If this story hit close to home, you already know what to do. Hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to The Secret Vault. New stories every week.